acts of military aggression between countries declined after the Cold War, but recently that trend line has reversed. We now have the highest number of active armed conflicts since World War II, and many more around the world that could flare up at any time. If we want to prevent catastrophe, it's helpful to know which simmering conflicts are most likely to boil over and which boilovers would cause the most damage. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Krys Boyd. For nearly 2 decades, the Council on Foreign Relations has been sending out these annual surveys. They send them to academics, foreign policy professionals, and also officials within the U.S. government. And in those surveys, they ask what they see as the most likely imminent conflicts around the world and just how destructive they might be to the interests of the United States. The point of the assessment, of course, is taking steps to keep those predictions from coming true. Paul Stairs is the General John W. Vessey Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention and Director of the Center for Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., which has just released the results of its Preventive Priorities Survey for 2026. Paul, welcome to Think.
Thanks very much for having me, Krys. Good to be here.
Broadly speaking, what are some of the reasons there are more interstate conflicts today than a decade ago?
Well, I think we're seeing the fraying of the international order that was created or started to be created by the US after World War II, in which there were some basic rules and norms of interstate behavior that were approved, like you don't attack your neighbor, you don't undertake aggressive action to occupy territory. You have the UN created to help mediate various conflicts around the world. You had a relatively stable relationship amongst the major powers. And in the last 5-10 years, that's all been sort of fraying as the American-led rules-based order, as it's called, has started to fray at the edges. And we're in this kind of in-between period between the old order and the new order that is yet to be established. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of instability, and people are sort of pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable, including engaging in cross-border attacks more often than they have in the past.
What kinds of things did the United States historically do to help stabilize global relations and quell violence, things that are not happening now?
So we did a number of things. We helped establish the United Nations, obviously, after World War II, and wrote much of the basic charter of the UN, which laid out the kind of code of conduct for states to operate by. We also created a worldwide web of alliances, which helped reassure a lot of countries threatened by other states to ensure that there was sort of broad stability in areas that have been prone to conflict. We also built up our own military strength during the Cold War, which we obviously kept up once the Cold War finished, to provide a deterrent to would-be adversaries. We made it very clear that global public goods, what we might mean by that are like the international waterways, outer space, airspace, were regulated by international agreement. And behind those agreements was the implicit threat, if you will, that the US would deal with any transgressors. And this all provided this sort of global web of international order of rules and norms of behavior. But as I say, in the recent years, that level of commitment from the US has been declining.
How did the idea for this survey come about initially?
So it began a long time ago now. This is the 18th year that we've been conducting this survey. And the broad goal was that, if the US wanted to get ahead of the curve, to try to keep the level of conflict around the world low, and not be blindsided by unforeseen crises and conflict, which could draw us in and lead us to commit military forces, that we had to try to look ahead, one thing. And moreover, when we looked ahead, we should try to focus on the sources of instability or conflict that posed the greatest threat to the US and was more likely to draw us in, so that we could use that kind of warning time to engage in conflict prevention, diplomacy, foreign assistance to lower the risk. And not every source of conflict around the world was equally threatening to the US. So the idea was not only would we get a sense of where should we be worried about, but which of those countries that were on the cusp of war or might fall into civil conflict, which of those posed the greatest threat to the US. So the survey was an idea to prioritize where the US should focus its attention, because there are many places around the world, as you appreciate, Krys, that where we could engage in preventive action, but they're not equally threatening to the US. So better to focus on the really dangerous places. So that's the underlying logic of the survey.
The Council on Foreign Relations faces some of the same challenges of any organization doing polling these days, which is to say that you can send it out to a whole lot of people and just a small number of people actually take the time to go through this. And this is quite an extensive ask of people. If, by my calculations, about 4% of the experts you send this survey to actually return it, do the folks on your end do any kind of weighting based on whether people are situated in government or academia and what part of the world they specialize in?
You're right about the difficulty in getting people to respond to surveys. This is a common problem for almost every online survey. And so we send it out, as you say, to many thousands of experts. And this year we had about, I think, 600 and so responses, which is pretty respectable. They tend to be council members. They have to be US citizens, because we're really asking Americans for their views on areas of the world to worry about. But beyond that, we don't ask for any personal information, gender, where they're living, level of education. It's all pretty anonymous, mainly because we feel that if you start asking that, people have become even more reluctant to respond. But we vet the list that goes out. These are all respected experts, and so we're pretty confident that we're getting good responses in return.
And before we get into the results this year, we should note that your organization is well aware that things like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and floods can have the potential to spark violence in parts of the world. This is not the kind of thing, though, that you're looking to predict with this particular document.
Yeah, every year people say, well, why didn't you look at the growing threat of climate change or an economic shock in the country or sudden, unrest caused by the outbreak of a pandemic or something like that. And while we recognize that these are risk factors for conflict, we don't deny that. It's just very difficult to kind of get your arms around these kinds of phenomena and assess their likelihood and potential impact. But just to underscore, we don't dismiss the importance of these variables or these risk factors, but we are mostly interested in relatively discrete political military events. Something you can say, if this happens in country X, then this might happen, or if these two countries' tensions rise, this is what the possible consequences are. So someone taking the survey kind of knows what they are really trying to assess, rather than broad-based trends. That's all it really is.
All right, so the tier 1 concerns in the publication are things that have a high potential likelihood in the year 2026 and a potentially high impact on U.S. interests. Um, let's talk about U.S. aggression toward Venezuela, which would destabilize the Maduro government. That is in the tier one list. I'm sure no one is happy about this, but you and I are speaking in mid-January. This one has already taken
Yes.
place.
Yes.
How might that destabilization play out now through the rest of the year?
Yeah. Just to back up, Krys, for your listeners, you refer to tier one. Perhaps I should have explained that when we collect the results from the survey, we organize them into three tiers based on relative likelihood and impact. So the tier one are the top tier, the ones that are either high likelihood of happening, high impact, or moderate with high impact. And so there is a system in which we sort them. But yes, Venezuela was on the list this year, one of the what we call the high highs, the high likelihood, high impact contingencies. Overall, I should say that of the 30 scenarios or conflict contingencies that we had in a survey this year, 28 were judged to be either moderately likelihood or highly likely, which is it's never been higher than this level of anxiety. And 17 of the 30 were considered of moderate or high impact on U.S. interests. Again, it's never been higher than this in previous years. So there's a sort of general level of anxiety. On Venezuela, yes, it was on the list, and this survey was conducted last November, so it wasn't as if this was done, a week ago when things were really ramping up in Venezuela. We're talking about a survey that was conducted before Thanksgiving, so I think the survey respondents were pretty prescient in seeing that this could be a serious risk for the U.S. And sure enough, what we identified in the survey has come to pass. We're still in the early days of that contingency. We still don't know how the U.S. intends to ensure what it wants out of Venezuela will stick. It's obviously deposed the previous leader, but there's a lot of questions about what comes next in Venezuela. And there's also consequences beyond Venezuela. We still don't know how this will affect the stability of Cuba, possibly even Colombia. President Trump has talked about taking military action against Mexican narco traffickers. So this could be the beginning of a lot of instability in the region. And it's certainly having ramifications beyond the region because, as I think you know, Krys, China is one of the major traders with Venezuela on its oil, and Russia has been a big supplier of arms to Venezuela. So, you can't just conduct a surgical raid on a country and not affect it to have larger implications, to say nothing of the broader kind of international legal issues that this particular operation has set in motion.
So, Paul, you mentioned this action in Venezuela that has repercussions for other countries in Latin America. Let's take the possibility of a U.S. strike on Mexico, which did not appear to many of your respondents to be imminently likely in 2026, although a possibility.
Right.
Does that change now that there's been a strike on Venezuela?
So I think a lot of people feel that now that President Trump has demonstrated predisposition to using force in the region to underscore what people call the Dunroe Doctrine, this corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that the U.S. wants to dominate the region, wants to safeguard America, particularly from drug traffickers, that it's entirely plausible that he will turn his attention to Mexico. Now, relations have generally been pretty good between the U.S. and Mexico, between Trump and President Sheinbaum. But I'm sure that there are people worried in Mexico that he might be emboldened now to strike narco traffickers. I still find it hard to believe he would go that route. I can see that the probably the biggest priority after Venezuela, in addition to actually making sure Venezuela is stable and secure, is probably Cuba. And I think if I were to guess, I would see greater pressure being applied to Cuba before they use military force against Mexican cartels. I think even President Trump would realize that that would be extremely disruptive to US Mexican relations. Mexico is a major trading partner with the US, and to engage in military force, I think, would be really very irresponsible and destabilizing. But you can never be sure with this president. Especially given what he said recently about using military force to take Greenland. So I would not dismiss anything, but if I'm to guess, I would say Cuba's more in the crosshairs now than Mexico.
To the extent that the U.S. initiated this conflict in Venezuela by removing and arresting President Maduro, do you think the U.S. has a role to play in alleviating that conflict, or will this have to be the result of actions by other forces?
You mean in Venezuela itself, or
In Venezuela, like how
yeah,
much does the U.S. do to quell things that are happening now?
so you may have heard the so-called pottery barn rule that if you break it, you own it, and so a lot of people feel that now that the U.S. has deposed its ruler, then will inevitably be drawn into determining the political future of that country, and the more you become involved in that, the more responsibility you bear for maintaining public order, for economic performance, and before long, you are almost the de facto controlling party for that country. Now, at the moment, they're trying very hard, I think, to maintain distance between running the country politically, but at the same time determining the country's political orientation, trading relations, investment. And squaring those two imperatives, if you will, is going to be really, really hard. And it's unclear whether the U.S. will be satisfied with essentially regime change without a change of the regime. The people that were running the country are still the same people that were running it beforehand. So will that really satisfy Trump? Much will depend how Vice President, now President Delcy Rodriguez, will respond to Trump's demands. But this could go in a lot of different directions, which could draw us in a very difficult, challenging way. We are not out of the woods yet by any means.
Speaking of not out of the woods, your respondents also expressed concern about increased conflict in the West Bank between Palestinians and Israelis, and separately, although related, renewed fighting in Gaza between Israelis and Hamas. How different are these potential problems depending on whether Israel is fighting Palestinians or Hamas?
Great question. It was surprising to many of us that both Gaza and the West Bank were ranked number one and two in the list of conflicts to worry about in 2026. This was a surprise to many of us. I think when it comes to Gaza, it reflects the fact that people have very low confidence that the Gaza situation has been truly settled. I think we should give President Trump credit that the situation there is better than it was 6 months ago, but people are still dying. I think since the so-called ceasefire was signed at the end of last year, over 400, maybe 500 Palestinians have died. So people are still dying there. And there was a report today about Israeli forces systematically destroying many buildings in Gaza. So this conflict isn't truly settled. It's just at a different phase than it was 3, 4, 5 months ago. Um, the issue, as you say, is different from the West Bank, which is really about um, Israeli claims to the West Bank and their desire to support settlers, essentially appropriating land controlled or owned by Palestinians, and the tensions that is creating. And that is different from Gaza, which is about rooting out a militant terrorist organization, sort of essentially embedded in Gaza, and it's just really hard to destroy such an organization that is so embedded in. And when it's quite conceivable that people supporting Hamas have retain a very strong anti-Israel position, regardless of being attacked relentlessly now for many months. And so it's I think I wouldn't have very high confidence if I was an Israeli military planner that they had truly rooted out Hamas and defeated it. I can imagine Hamas is reconstituting its forces and weapons and so on, and it will take much more inducements by the people of Gaza to reject Hamas than purely trying to smash Hamas. In the West Bank, this I'm particularly concerned, and I think this came through in the survey, with the Israeli government's seemingly unconstrained efforts to appropriate more and more Palestinian land, which in effect pretty much removes the chances or makes it incredibly difficult for the Palestinians to actually have a viable state in the West Bank, which has always been part of this broad um, equation for peace for land, or land for peace. And that is becoming less and less a reality, just because more and more land in the West Bank is being taken over by Israel and controlled by Israel, making it very difficult to have a viable state there. And I think that's, if we're honest, that is the strategy of the Israeli government. And I think it's a powder keg. There's already been an increase in the number of clashes and settlers' deaths, and Palestinian deaths in the West Bank, and more and more licenses for construction have been issued in the last month or so. So I think this is a tinder keg, and combined with Gaza, the possibility of resumption of military action with Iran. The idea that the Middle East is this stable place now as a result of various ceasefire agreements over the last year, I think, is extremely optimistic. We could be in for a really rough time over the next 12 months.
And the reason these Middle East conflicts are of particular concern for the United States is because we remain sort of heavily involved in managing political relationships there.
Yes, we are the principal security guarantor for Israel. We are the principal supplier of weapons to Israel and other assistance. We have committed over many decades to the survival of Israel for all good reasons. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But it has meant that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to extricate ourselves from actions undertaken by Israel to do things that they believe is in their security interests. And we are, almost impossibly entwined with the actions of Israel toward Gaza, toward the West Bank, towards Lebanon, Syria, all over the Middle East. And we become implicated in the actions of Israel for good and bad, and which has led to so much frustration among many people about what is seen as sort of unwavering, uncritical support by the US toward Israel. And it makes our relations with many other countries that much harder because of it.
Paul, a number of your respondents were quite concerned about the potential for intensification of the war between Russia and Ukraine. What are the most significant potential effects of this? It's really been a battle grinding on for years now. What are the effects for people who are living in places affected by the fighting between
Oh,
Ukraine
well,
and Russia?
it's been devastating, particularly for obviously the parts of Ukraine along the main line of contact in eastern Ukraine. That whole area, swath of land, probably 20% of Ukraine, has been completely devastated, and the cities have been flattened. And then you've got the major cities to the west, obviously the capital, Kiev, but other major cities and ports, they are being attacked relentlessly almost every night. I visited Kiev earlier last year and spent pretty much most of the time in a bomb shelter, and I can attest to the psychological stress that these constant attacks cause, as well as the destruction that has been caused on Ukrainian cities, on their energy infrastructure. They're dealing without energy for many many hours of the day, and of course, they're losing a lot of people. Maybe since the war began, at least the full scale invasion in 2022, they probably lost around 400,000, maybe more people. Now, that's less than Russia, but Ukraine is a smaller country. And so it's had a devastating effect. And this conflict is nowhere near ending. There's been a lot of hopeful diplomacy in the last 2 months, and I think the U.S. and Ukraine are more aligned now, along with the Europeans, on a sort of coherent negotiating position to take to the Russians. But President Putin of Russia, he has shown no indication of being flexible with those terms when it comes to ceding control, territorial control, allowing Western forces to be deployed in as peacekeepers or essentially security guarantors in Ukraine. So this war we're not close to it being over. But I do again want to credit President Trump for trying, and he made it clear from day one of his presidency that he wanted to bring this war to an end, and I salute him for it. But we're still a long ways away, I think, unless I'm completely misreading what the Russians have been saying recently about their willingness to accept these latest terms.
And there are numerous challenges for the United States on that front, but a big one is just threading that needle, right, between how much support to give to Ukraine without antagonizing Putin.
Yes, President Trump has made no secret of his desire for improved relations with Russia. And, there's some big issues that would benefit from improved relations, not least the future of strategic arms control. Some of your listeners will know that just in a few weeks, the last remaining strategic arms control deal, the New START agreement that regulates long range offensive nuclear weapons, will come to an end. And so there are various reasons why it would be good for the US and Russian relations to be ultimately normalized, but they got to get past Ukraine. And until that is solved, there really can be no um, uh, realistic chance of improved US Russia relations. And there's just, as I say, a lot of hurdles ahead before we get anywhere near that.
Paul, the survey also notes something that ironically um, could happen very close to home and yet is not on every American's radar screen, and that is the threat of political violence. What
Yeah,
are some of the factors that increase the possibility of this domestically?
I'm really glad that you raised this, Krys. You know, 2 or 3 years ago, that concern would never have appeared in the survey. And it was really only by, if you will, popular demand when we were considering what to include in the survey 2 or 3 years ago, when President Trump was on the docket for the election. We'd had January 6th. That people said you had to include this as a risk of conflict. You can't just be about foreign conflicts. And sure enough, the first year we included it was by far the number one concern. This was right before the last presidential election. And here we are, it's considered both highly likely and highly consequential for US interests. And I think the answer to your question is fairly straightforward. We've seen an increase in the level of political polarization in the US. We've seen an increase in the number of people resorting to violent means to pursue their political goals. During the last presidential election, we had two known assassination attempts against President-elect Trump. And we've had a number of incidents of, I'd say, violent acts against sitting political figures. You know, Josh Shapiro comes to mind in Pennsylvania. His house was burned down when his family was inside it. And the assassination of Charlie Kirk, this leading MAGA voice. So it's very clear that Americans are extremely concerned about this rising level of political violence and polarization in the U.S. And when you consider that this country has such a is awash in weaponry, personal weapons, guns, and so on, it's a really toxic mix of people having both the motives and the means and often the opportunities to carry out violent acts. We're still a very open society in our access to leading figures and public events and so on. And so, our risk of this growing in the coming 12 months and beyond is, especially this year with the midterms coming up, this is a serious threat that we have to consider in 2026.
In the category of moderate likelihood, high impact, many experts are worried about some kind of disruptive cyber attack on critical U.S. infrastructure, either by a state actor or a non-state actor in an act of terrorism. What counts as the kind of critical infrastructure that could be affected by such an attack?
Great question, Krys. So this has been appearing in the survey almost every year since we began 18 years ago, and it's always highly ranked. People are generally aware that there is this growing risk that our critical information networks could be attacked and undermined or compromised. And when we talk of critical infrastructure, there's several sort of sub networks, if you will. The leading one is our financial system, and the system that supports the trades on Wall Street every day, financial transactions, currency connections. Most people think that's pretty strong now. They've taken a lot of effort to make them resistant and defendable against attack. Then you have various healthcare systems, hospitals, the emergency system, services system. People think that's a little more vulnerable and subject to being attacked. A big one related to the earlier question, of course, is our electoral system. and the integrity of voting machines, and the way we count the outcome of elections, and that's another element of critical infrastructure. And then you get things like airlines, transportation, rail networks. That's another area of critical infrastructure, and there are sort of different levels of vulnerability in each of those, depending on where in the country you're talking about. Some are more modern than others. And then finally, there's the sort of the energy network in the US. Everything from your local gas pump to ports bringing in energy to refineries, and again, another part of the everyday life in America that could also be attacked. Um, it's generally assumed that our major adversaries have figured out ways to either infiltrate, undermine these systems in wartime. But we're always worried about non-state actors, terrorist groups doing this at any time, and it's a constant battle. My own organization, we're under constant attack every day from various hackers, people phishing for information, and it puts a huge financial burden on corporations and government institutions. But and this is kind of what we have to live with now. The new sort of wrinkle here is how AI, artificial intelligence, could be enabled to carry out these attacks. And they will be able to detect the weakest link, if you will, and be able to figure out ways to circumvent defenses that would be hard for humans to do. And so a lot of people are now worried about how AI could enable cyber attacks. Same with various biohazards. AI could also be used to develop a new pathogen more potent than COVID, which could be another real game changer in terms of our sense of security in this country.
And God forbid this actually happens, but in addition to whatever infrastructure damage or interruption would result from an attack like this, depending on whether the assailant is, directed by a national government somewhere or is a member of some rogue terrorist group, there are these big questions about how you strike back, what you do about it.
Yeah, well, how you deter them, because you can't hold much of value if you don't know who's actually doing it. And as you say, Krys, how do you strike back? Who pays the price of our retaliation that would deter them from doing it again, or think about doing it in the first place? And if it's some cyber address in North Korea, or an ungoverned space in West Africa, or so on. What is? How do we redirect the penalty for these kinds of attacks? It's extremely difficult to hold anybody or anything to account.
Paul, to the extent that, particularly in the Trump administration, the United States has pulled back from some of its traditional role as the stabilizer and peacemaker in conflicts around the globe, what does this mean for allies and powerful countries that are in a position to take up the slack left by U.S. cuts in these services?
Well, there's a lot of concern and apprehension that if the US pulls back or does things that make our allies, our long-standing allies, think twice about our willingness to come to their assistance, that they might start taking matters into their own hands, possibly developing nuclear weapons to deter the countries that most threaten them. You can look at possibly South Korea maybe developing nuclear weapons, which would probably trigger Japan to do it, and Taiwan. And if they feel that the U.S. is less than committed to their security, then they could say, well, we have to have the ultimate deterrent. Same in Europe, and this is playing out today with the threats that President Trump and other officials have made toward Greenland, part of Denmark, a NATO ally. And the trust that our European NATO allies have in us, and Canada too, I should add, is at an all-time low. They no longer truly believe that the US will have their back, because the US has more or less said, we're not sure we really want to keep committing to the defense of Europe. And so the Europeans over the last 12 months have embarked in a huge rearmament campaign, which I think is a good thing, that they have to take more responsibility for the defense of the continent. But you're starting to hear countries like Poland, even Germany, talk about the necessity of developing nuclear weapons to compensate for the lack of trust that they have in the U.S. Nuclear umbrella or military umbrella in general. Also, you could see countries like China thinking, well, this may be the opportunity to take advantage of the U.S. being distracted elsewhere, or is the U.S. truly committed to the defense of Taiwan? And so you start getting actions taken by countries to test the limits of our support or our commitment to the prior agreements, as you say, help maintain order around the world. Just to give you a statistic, Krys, that is not in the report, but over the last 12 months, 10 capital cities have been attacked by other countries in this period. Unbelievable high number in which I can't think of another year in recent memory where so many capital cities have been attacked by other countries. And of course, the U.S. just did this recently in Caracas, but I can go through a list of capital cities just in the 12 months, particularly in the Middle East, but also in South Asia too, that were attacked. And this is part of this general erosion or decaying of the old order, and people feeling that they can do things now that in previous years were considered really essentially well beyond the norm of acceptable behavior.
We've only had time in this conversation to really survey the tip of the iceberg, and there are a lot more conflicts that are of concern to people who pay close attention to these things. Your point and the point of the Council on Foreign Relations in producing this document is not simply to make us feel bad or frightened, although I would argue you've done both.
Yes.
But what makes this an optimistic exercise to go through each year?
Well, we hope to obviously direct attention to the places which we feel really warrant concern. This year, we also asked survey respondents, are there opportunities for peacemaking around the world too? We felt that it shouldn't just be about risk, but also opportunities. And we had a lot of positive respondents saying, even though things look bleak, the U.S. still has a lot of leverage in parts of the world to make a difference. President Trump boasts that he's settled 8 conflicts in the last 12 months. Now, we can question whether that was really true, but there are still many opportunities out there in which the U.S. does have some leverage, can use other players into the conflict and get them to engage in peacekeeping. And so, yes, the outlook is not looking too good, but we can't overlook these other possibilities, and we should not give up on the possibilities for peace in many areas. Otherwise, we truly will be depressed about the future.
Paul, thanks so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Krys. It's been a delight to talk with you today.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Krys Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.